Thanks for listening to the ArtTactic Podcast. I'm your host, Adam Green. This past week was one of the first major tests for the art market of the year when we had post-war and contemporary auctions in London at all of the major auction houses. There were hundreds of works up for sale, and overall the auctions, they seemed to do okay. Not great, not bad, but just okay. We wanted to break down the auctions further and get a feel for how people are feeling now. So in this week's episode of the podcast, we're joined by Margaret Carrigan, the news editor at Artnet News. Margaret covered the auctions for Artnet News. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Thanks so much for listening. Margaret, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Absolutely. I thought you did a great job covering the auction for Artnet News, and we really appreciate you joining us to recap the sales here as well. It really feels like we're at an interesting point in the market where there's a lot of conversations happening, a lot of observing of auction results and any kind of data points to better gauge where the market is at the moment. So before we even talk about these auctions that just occurred and how they did, I'm curious your take as to what the mood of the market was like heading into these sales.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the mood was cautious more than anything. I mean, 2023 has been kind of well documented at this point that it was just kind of a bummer of a year. Like it was, the market was really soft. Nothing really performed the way people wanted it to. Sales were, strong sales were hard to come by. I think something I was thinking about in relationship to like heading into the new year, back in February, I pulled some stats on just the like average price per lot in 2023, which that's using the Artnet's price database. And I thought some of the stuff that I found in there was kind of interesting in terms of mood. Just that the average price per lot in 2023 was 35K, which was down from 43K in 2022. But worth more exceptional to that is that there was that was actually like the lowest average lot price in a decade, with the exception of, the pandemic altered year of 2020, which is just a hair less than that. So I think that to me really suggested that, there's a lot of material hitting the auction block last year, like one of the highest years ever in the last decade. And yet the average lot price was really low, which just, I think buyers are being really conservative. They just were not splashing out on a lot of sales. I think going into 2024, it's kind of the same. Everyone's treading water a little bit. In the financial sector at large, stock markets are up right now. There's speculation that inflationary pressures are going to ease, but I don't think there's like a ton of confidence in the market yet. And I think that's really mirrored in the art market as well.
Yeah, it's very interesting that we have the stock market at an all-time high. And if you simply assumed there's always a strong correlation between the stock market and the art market, you'd assume the art market would be in a very strong place as well. But of course, there are several other indicators that gauge just the health of an economy beyond the stock market. For example, we're in a high interest rate environment for the first time in a long time, and I think that's likely impacting people's behaviors differently for different asset classes. And of course, there are also activities within the art market that are impacting the overall art market, such as the steady and sometimes overly aggressive rise in primary pricing over the last few years. So it's certainly going to be interesting to see how these kind of indicators impact the art market moving forward in the near future and in the longer term future. But going back to the auctions, I know it's not a simple thing to try to assess the overall performance of an auction season, given, right, there's hundreds of artworks up for sale and they're by a variety of artists in terms of points in their career and level of demand for the work to begin with. But how would you say the auction season did overall?
I would say meh. It was okay. Certainly wasn't a washout. I think kind of overall we're seeing a little bit of a continuation of last year where we're just not seeing like the bigger prices for things. But that's not to say there weren't some decent lots in there that sold really well. Christie's, it was the best of the three major auction houses last week, and they netted $250 million across both their 20th century and 21st century sales, and then the Artist Surreal, which was like a slightly separate sale after that. And that was 17% up on the equivalent sales last year, which is, welcome. And then I think that, but it also kind of just reflects in terms of like Christie's was bringing a lot more to the table this time around. They had 87 works before their withdrawn lots versus Sotheby's 70 lots. Sotheby's brought in 127 million, and that was on the lower side of their estimate before the sale. Both of the Christie's and Sotheby's had about the same like equivalent like sell-through rate, excuse me, somewhere in the mid to upper 70s, which, is okay. Again, like it wasn't anything really to write home about. I don't think there was anything that was really standing out in those sales. Phillips, though, it did struggle a little bit more. It really it brought in 13.7 million pounds, which is $17.4 million. And that's a third less than the same sale last year. It's barely hit their low estimate, and if you look at the hammer totals for that, it fell short of its goal by about 3 million. And I think a contributing factor was the withdrawal of three major works before the sale, and about half of the works that did sell in the sale went for at or below their estimate. And I think that kind of played out across all of the houses, where there was just a real middling of sales across all of the lots. It was a little bit hit or miss.
And so if we dig into some of the specific results during the week, what were a few prices achieved that stood out to you, either positive or negative ones?
Ultimately, this was something noted last year too, is that there was still plenty of good sales, especially for younger or undervalued artists. That's continuing. I think, for even if Phillips kind of struggled, there was a lot of good records set. One for Jesse Mockran and Kehinde Wiley were set at Phillips. And then also there was a Christie's, there were good results for Alison Katz and Jade Fado-Jutuni. And also at Sotheby's, we saw a great result for the Francoise Gillot portrait that came up. That one got a lot of press because it was brought by Ariana Huffington, and it was a portrait from the 1940s. It didn't set a record, but it did kind of triple its estimate, and it was really kind of, again, looking at undervalued artists. I think her Gillot's record is set at 1.3 million right now, and it didn't quite fetch that, but it still was a really strong result. I think it's the fourth most expensive work set by her, and I was looking into her market a bit more, and it looks like over the last 5 years, about half of the Gillot works that have come up for auction have gone for well beyond their estimates, just kind of showing that that market is really developing. On the higher end of the spectrum, the higher price lots, there still isn't like a ton of ambition that we're noticing kind of bidding for those. One thing I noted at the Christie sale is that, the Francis Bacon and the David Hockney and the 20th and 21st century sale, they were the two biggest lots, and they both hammered either like below or at their estimate. So I think ultimately, again, it's still pretty cautious out there, especially when you're laying out a ton of cash.
So we have these auction results from the week, and now we try to make sense of them and figure out, what does this mean for the broader art market? Do you feel like the mood of the market has changed in any meaningful way because of this auction season and its results? Or are we sort of kicking the can down the road and sentiment has remained the same, and we just see how things continue to play out moving forward?
I think we're can kicking, to use your turn of phrase. I think ultimately it wasn't a big, result. It wasn't a big enough result really to say that the tides are turning. But again, there are some larger, more macroeconomic factors that could play out, down the road that do create a little bit more confidence, especially going into maybe the May auctions in New York. Maybe things will have changed a little bit by then, enough for people to feel a little more secure. And also, just the Marquee Week in New York is generally just a big juggernaut for sales. So if people are feeling excited, we'll definitely see it then. And if they're not, I think we'll see more of the same, just kind of middling along until tides change.
Yeah, well, we'll just have to see how things play out. And one of the next big things to play out in the auction market, at least, are the May auctions, which are about 2 months away. So I imagine the auction houses are finishing their auction catalogs for the season, getting in a few last things. Do you have a sense as to how the May auctions are lining up, and how can that auction season impact sentiment?
I think if it goes well, it will be a big confidence booster. However, I think there's probably a lot of sales strategies being retooled right now in light of the London auctions and kind of scraping together how they're going to put together a really good offering for the New York sales this year that could potentially change people's mind, make people feel a little bit safer. Um, a thing to remember too is that, down the line, right after the May sales, Sotheby's is also going to be changing its fee structure. So there's a lot of unknowns, I think, in the auction world right now and how these kinds of things are going to stack up over the course of this year. And I don't think it's going to be one of these. I don't think it's going to be a season that will make or break anything. I think there's a lot of waiting with bated breath to see how, again, larger economic factors play out and how also within the auction houses, some of these additional fee structures might shape how sales work overall.
Well, we'll definitely be following along to see how those auction catalogs come together, as well as monitoring the results. Margaret, thanks so much again for coming onto the podcast and helping us recap one of the first major auction tests of the year, the London auctions. If our listeners haven't already, they should definitely check out your coverage of the sales on Artnet News. And you're also on social media, often talking about the art market and the art world. Where can we follow you there?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram. The handle is Real Life Maggie. And pleasure talking to you today.
Perfect. Thanks again, Margaret.